If there was two things that anybody could do to make significant strides to improving their health, it would be to avoid the consumption of seed oils and to avoid the consumption of fructose containing sugars. The vegan diet without supplementation cannot sustain life. How can that be the most healthy diet? The data, the unpublished data, but it was made available to the TGA, indicated that females increase their risk of fractured hip, which is a really bad thing to happen, I don't need to tell you, by 5 times. 500% increased risk of hip fracture in females who were taking this drug for 12 months. This is not hidden information. This is information which is accessible to everybody. And everybody who reads this, you should be shocked.
I'm Lucy Johnston, and this is GB News Originals. Now, many of you might need to forget everything you thought you knew about weight loss. For decades, we've been told eat more plants, cut red meat, avoid saturated fat, and exercise more. But what if that advice is not just wrong, but what if it's making us sicker? Dr. Paul Mason is a world-leading sports medicine physician who has trained and treated elite athletes, including Olympians. And he's here to challenge years of dietary orthodoxy and dismantle what he describes as junk science. He also claims there are deadly dangers of vegan diets for children and an impending epidemic of bone fractures from weight loss drugs. Welcome, Dr. Mason.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
So, Dr. Mason, the UK's Eat Well guide still advises that half of our calories come from carbs and starchy foods, and that saturated fat should be just about 11%. Now, your research suggests this is not just outdated, but it's actually fueling obesity. Could you talk about the evidence that supports this claim?
Well, first of all, there never was any evidence that we ought be restricting saturated fat to such an extreme degree. And let's be fair, 11% of total caloric intake is a pretty significant restriction. And nor is there any evidence that carbohydrates are healthful, certainly not representing more than 50% of our caloric intake. So when the dietary guidelines were first developed, there was never any science, all the randomized controlled trials on balance available at the time. And when I say randomized controlled trials, I'll talk about that because that's the best level of evidence we can have, indicated that saturated fat was not harmful. So, unfortunately, this one myth that saturated fat is harmful has had a whole series of flow-on effects. It's a whole series of dominoes knocking down. Well, if you're not having saturated fat, what do you replace it with? Well, we need to have more carbohydrates, which turn into sugar in the bloodstream. We increase our intake of seed oils, which, while we're told they're healthy, there's no evidence demonstrating that they are. And the best quality and the largest trials that have ever studied them actually seem to indicate that they're actually harmful. The reality is the food pyramid was not a construction of science. It's never been scientific, and it never will be scientific. And morphing it into what we call the food plate, and using some weasel words around the type of foods we eat and so on and so forth, it doesn't make it any more scientific. It's unfortunately having significant consequences on the health of populations around the world. And I suspect we're still going to have that, that harm continuing for possibly a couple more decades before the science wins out.
Have you any idea why we have decades of advice telling us to avoid saturated fats and, have a large proportion of our diet with carbohydrates if it's not based on science? Where on earth did it come from?
Well, I think we can trace it back to our fear of cholesterol. So, and it probably goes all the way back to President Eisenhower. So he used to smoke, up to 4 packets of cigarettes a day and so on and so forth. And obviously we know now that that's very unhealthy. But back then he actually, he had a heart attack while he was in office. And the physicians at the time, they ended up attributing that to dietary cholesterol, to dietary saturated fats. We now know that's absolutely preposterous idea. There was never any science demonstrating that at all. But the whole movement that dietary saturated fat could be harmful actually stemmed from President Eisenhower's heart attack. And that actually ultimately led to the formation of the dietary goals for Americans, which then morphed into the dietary guidelines and the food pyramid and the food plate, which we still have with us today. Now, let's just put a few facts on the table because it's one thing to say these words, there's no evidence that saturated fat's a problem, but the reason we fear saturated fat is because of this misguided notion that it might increase the level of LDL in our blood, what is commonly and incorrectly referred to as bad cholesterol, so low density lipoprotein. So, fact number one to put on the table is that there's never been any evidence that saturated fat, dietary saturated fat, increases LDL. Not a skerrick of evidence has ever substantiated that. It is pure fanciful theory. I can go to any one of the textbooks on my bookshelf, or the biochemistry textbooks, so on and so forth, nothing in there. No scientific papers have ever been able to demonstrate that dietary saturated fat increases cholesterol level, especially LDL. So the other problem is that when we look at populations of people and we analyze how long they live for, and we've got some very good prospective trials that have done this, look at tens of thousands of participants, we find that people with the highest level of LDL actually tend to live longer. In actual fact, the shortest lived people are those with the lowest levels of LDL. So this premise that eating saturated fat must be dangerous for us is actually called out on two lies. One, there's no evidence that saturated fat increases LDL. And even if it did, the science would tend to suggest that having higher LDL is associated with longevity. So it's really built on a house of cards. And I suspect, I mean, this myth that saturated fat causes high LDL causes early death, this is really the foundation for a $1 trillion industry, pharmaceutical industry, selling cholesterol lowering drugs. So we used to talk about
Statins.
billion-dollar drugs with like the statin medications and so on and so forth. Well, I think it's now correct to refer to statins as a $1 trillion drug. I mean, their sales around the world have been enormous, and they continue to be enormous.
There must be, I mean, it can't just stem from Eisenhower's heart attack. There must be something that backs up this drive towards LDL lowering or cholesterol lowering drugs that carries on and on and on. I mean, that can't be just based on nothing. What's driving that?
Well, it's not based on nothing, but I think the interesting story is, so if we go back a little bit further with Eisenhower, so why did the doctors who were treating President Eisenhower, who incidentally they diagnosed him with indigestion from a hamburger before they actually diagnosed him with a heart attack? They actually sent him back to bed, and he woke up at 1 p.m. or thereabouts the next day, and they realized, oh, he's actually had a heart attack. All they'd done is they sent him back to bed and injected him with morphine. But anyway, so that's caliber of the medical care which he was receiving at the time. Now they were, I guess, entranced by somebody called Anel Keys, and he's an infamous figure. He graced the cover of Time. By all accounts, he was a political pugilist. If there was somebody who disagreed with him on any topic of science, he would browbeat them into submission. There was no such thing as a gentleman's academic discourse with Ansel Keys in the room. And, he was quite a bully, and, he didn't let facts get in the way of a good story, it's probably fair to say. So he actually leveraged a Russian scientist who's by the name of Nikolay Anakov. And Nikolay Anakov, he actually fed some rabbits some cholesterol-rich seed oil and found that it led to problems in the arteries of these rabbits. Now, not to mind that rabbits are herbivores, and no animal is ever is suited to eating seed oils, and rabbits certainly aren't suited to having cholesterol. I mean, that's just not a part of the natural
So,
diet. So,
so really what you're saying is lab-based studies backed up this claim, but there were lab-based studies that were flawed because of what they were feeding the animals. Is that kind of
well, essentially, I mean, this whole concept, yeah, the whole concept that dietary cholesterol could be problematic, it stemmed from Nikolay Anikov's research on rabbits, which I think anybody can understand is, significantly methodologically flawed. And unfortunately, Ansel Keys, he was a physiologist, I believe. Um, he believed this notion, and he set out to prove this notion that dietary saturated fat was harmful. So he started off with what he called the 6-country study and rolled into the 7-country study. And he was heavily criticized for what can only be termed cherry picking. So he picked some countries that actually had and mapped the risk of heart disease against their dietary consumption of saturated fat. And he felt he was able to establish, when he plotted these on a graph, a linear relationship or a curvilinear relationship between saturated fat consumption and risk of heart disease. But where the accusations of cherry picking come in is that some other scientists of the day, they actually identified that at that time of publication, there was data for 22 odd countries available that he could have plotted. So the question is, why is he only relying on 6? When there could have been 22? And that's a question that supporters of Ansel have never answered. And it's it's a glaring fault. And there is, people will still argue till they're blue in the face that his 6-country study and then the subsequent 7-country study still hold up. And yet nobody can ever explain, why don't you use all the data? And when you use all the data, this curvilinear relationship, it seriously weakens to the point of it being completely insignificant. So, we started out based on rabbit research being fed seed oil and cholesterol. It was built on what we call, methodologically flawed epidemiological studies. And the myth has only ever been strengthened ever since. But that doesn't, diminish the fact. And as I said on the outset, so there's very solid research. I believe it was Nina Teicholz has published some research looking at what actually the level of evidence for the dietary guidelines at their inception. And it's very, very clearly been demonstrated that I think this research has been published in the British Medical Journal, is very clear evidence that there was no evidence to justify the inception of our dietary guidelines. But
Where is that?
unfortunately,
Sorry,
they've
go
just
ahead.
gone from strength to strength, and we continue to accept these lies today. But, and I'm very happy to get into the talking about the individual studies, but, whenever we've, interrogated the science, whenever you interrogate the science, it's very clear. Saturated fat is not harmful. Seed oils probably are harmful, almost certainly are harmful. And carbohydrates, low-fat carbohydrates, can wreak havoc on our metabolic health.
Do you want to save a boatload of cash this summer, wherever you have a trip planned? The one thing you're going to need is access to the internet and on the go. And you can do that easily with Saily. Hit the link in the description to get 15% of your first eSIM plan ready for your trip so you can browse to your heart's content. Saily gets you a local SIM card you can use when traveling so you don't have to pay those crazy roaming fees just to send a message or check the latest news. Now, they've got plans in over 160 countries, 8 regions, so pretty much everywhere, wherever you're going, they'll be able to make sure you're connected. So how does it work? All you've got to do is this. Hit the link in the description to download the app. It will work on iOS or Android. Buy a plan. You can choose an amount of data and time frame that suits you best. And then just install the eSIM on your phone. When you land at your holiday destination, you can activate your plan instantly. And if that wasn't enough, Saily eSIMs only ever have to be installed once. So when you go on your next trip, you just buy a plan for a new country, turn that eSIM back on, and boom, you're back watching me on GB News. I'll be using a Saily SIM on my next holiday because it's actually faster than some of the hotel Wi-Fis. You can get unlimited data if you want, so you can scroll away to your heart's content. And when you leave the hotel, you don't have to do that annoying thing of Wi-Fi hopping because you've got constant connectivity wherever you go. And they've got 24/7 support as well, and a full refund policy if your eSIM isn't compatible. So get sorted for your next trip. Download Saely using the link in the description below. And if you use the code NEWS at checkout, you'll get an exclusive 15% discount on us. So click the link, download Saely, and use the code NEWS at checkout.
Yes, you've talked in the past about quality of evidence, and the poorest quality evidence is just sort of looking at correlations and associations, and the best quality evidence is proper randomized controlled trials. But if saturated fats are not the villain, what makes you think that carbohydrates may be? What evidence is there for that?
Well, first of all, why don't we just go back and look at the studies where they tried to find that saturated fat was the problem. So the very first study, what we call randomized controlled trial. Now, the thing about randomized controlled trials is that they take participants in a subject and they randomly allocate them to either receive the intervention, in which this case will be reduced saturated fat, or to be in a control group where there's no changes to their saturated fat intake. And by randomly allocating people, we're able to overcome the natural biases that would be inherent in the study. So, for example, if we just went into the population and we said, I'm just going to look at everybody who's eating a low-fat diet, and I'm going to compare them to people who are eating a high-fat diet, we'll see who's healthier. Now, that is a fundamentally flawed study because we have something called the healthy user bias. We have indoctrinated people for decades now that saturated fat is harmful. And so people who care about their health are going to avoid the saturated fat. People who care about their health are also going to exercise. They're going to sleep. They're not going to overindulge in alcohol. They're probably not going to be smoking cigarettes. So there's all these other behaviors which are associated with health, which we bias against. So if we just select what people are having in the natural environment, it's not a controlled experiment. We have all these biases. But if we randomly allocate people to one of the other groups, then we're going to get, the healthy people are going to be evenly split, the people who are trying to follow healthy lifestyles. So the randomization process within trials is critical to ensuring that the findings are as robust and as evidence-based as possible. So if we start with that as the gold standard, that's the kind of study we want to see whether saturated fat in the diet is good for us or unhealthy. So the 1965, there was a trial of corn oil and seed oil, and they were looking at what would happen if we supplemented people with seed oil. And they actually found there was an increased risk of mortality. Pardon me. Then that was followed up by the Sydney Diet Heart Study. I think it was about 1966, and they took Australian males based around the region of Sydney where I am now, and they examined. They said, well, you guys have had heart attacks, you're very high risk. We're going to take half of you and we're going to reduce the amount of saturated fat in your diet, and we're going to replace that with seed oil. And they had those subjects who reduced the saturated fat actually had an increased mortality of 62%. And that's not insignificant. If you say to anybody, "Oh, I'm going to increase your risk of dying by 62%," that's pretty significant. Then there was the Minnesota coronary experiment, which is about 7,500 participants or thereabouts, and they also found that when they took saturated fat out of the diet and they replaced it with seed oil, that the more, and it did work to lower their cholesterol level. By the way, seed oils, I won't bore you with the details, but they actually have some unique effects on the body that will reduce your cholesterol. But they actually found that the lower you reduce the cholesterol with the seed oils, the higher the chance of death in these subjects. And then the real nail in the coffin for this comes from what we call the Women's Health Initiative. This was a massive, massive study on about 47,000 females. Just for reference, the cost of this study was about $700 million US. I mean, we don't get a do-over on this. This is as good as the research gets. And these subjects were followed for about 8 years. And there was a trouble in communicating the actual findings. So if you go to when the results were finally published in this paper, the Women's Health Initiative study, the results table, when you look at it there, because as doctors, we just go to the results table, let's get the summary. It showed that there was no significant findings, no statistically significant findings. But if you go to the text and on page 661 of the actual study, they said, oh, yes, the females who were randomized, who were unfortunate enough, dare I say, to be randomized to the low fat intervention, their risk of complications like heart attacks and so on and so forth was increased by 26%. So of all the 4 studies, the large-scale randomized controlled trials that have ever been performed looking at saturated fats and seed oils, they have actually found that lowering saturated fats in the diet was associated with harm. And when I say harm, we're not just talking about some esoteric concept here, we're talking about increased risk of death. So, when I guess you ask the question, well, what evidence do you have that sugar is a culprit and saturated fat isn't the culprit? Well, first of all, that's a pretty solid evidence there. Whenever we've looked at it with good quality research, saturated fat is not a problem. And then we have an abundance of evidence. So we know that, diabetes is associated with the tripling of the risk of having a stroke or having a heart attack. Dementia, we're now calling dementia type 3 diabetes because, and I can talk more about that and exactly why. We know that there's at least 12, 13 different cancers that are causally associated with high blood glucose. So we know that, and diabetes is a condition where you have too much sugar in the blood. So when you ask the question, well, is there, how can we possibly know that sugar or carbohydrates is a problem? The question is, well, how could we possibly not? It's staring us in the face.
So you've also looked at red meat and cancer claims. The Lancet and others have linked red meat to bowel cancer, but we've seen lots of alarming headlines. And you say their science is also weak and one-sided. Can you talk us through where you see major flaws in that analysis and why you think these studies, including rat studies, are junk science?
I mean, this is absolutely fascinating, and I do have to give credit to my colleague, Dr. Georgia Reid, who did a very nice analysis on the World Health Organization document that basically really started this fear-mongering campaign against red meat. Now, the big problem with this study is, so first of all, this was the two-paper, two-page document. It's been cited over 7,000 times. It's got a life of its own. It's breathed life into every vegan activist the world over. But the trouble is it's really based on junk science, and people assume that because it's put out by the World Health Organization that it must have, some scientific credibility. It probably would fail, a primary school science show. You wouldn't submit it in grade 3. And so let's talk about why. So first of all, I already talked about the benefits of randomized controlled trials. We get to randomize people. So when we do studies where we just look at what people are doing,
Is this the basis for demonizing meat?
this is the
Would-
basis for demonizing meat. This was a 2-page document put out by the World Health Organization that considered meat to be just as carcinogenic as cigarettes. It was put in the same category. Widely labeled as being the death knell of red meat in the diet, and it was subsequently relied upon heavily when we got the Lancet paper and recommending that people have 7 grams of red meat a day. Just a complete and utter nonsense. But we start off with what we call epidemiological studies or associational studies. So first of all, there was hundreds, about 700-800 epidemiological studies looking at the association of red meat to cancer. This study, from memory, looked at 29 of them. So from the outset, we can say, well, there's a bit of cherry picking going on there, isn't it? How do you get 800 studies down to 29 studies? But even then, the story gets interesting because of the 29 odd studies, and this is from memory, I think it was 15 of them showed that red meat didn't cause cancer and 14 of them did. So even then, on balance, in terms of number of studies, there were more studies that showed that red meat wasn't deleterious than was deleterious when we're looking at the epidemiological studies. So then we come to the experimental studies. Now, as you know, I like experimental studies. If when things are randomized, we actually can show cause. We can, if we really want to prove that red meat causes cancer, then we give people red meat and we see if they develop cancer. But except they did it in mice. Now they had 6 experimental studies, and I think 2 or 3 of them actually had a similar protocol to this. And you cannot make this up. So one of the studies, there's a chemical called azoxymethane. This is better known as rocket fuel. Now, you can imagine that injecting rocket fuel into a mouse is probably not going to be good for the mouse. In actual fact, we know that azoxymethane causes bowel cancer. And when scientists are studying bowel cancer, they often inject azoxymethane into the rodents to cause bowel cancer. This is how we cause bowel cancer. So they had
Meat, and they were showing that the mice eating meat more likely to develop bowel cancer, but they were also injected with a cancer-causing.
so close. But there's a key point that still, you can't even make this up. So yes, they fed these mice what they considered to be a red meat surrogate. They injected them with this chemical that's known to cause bowel cancer, and still the mice didn't develop bowel cancer. Now listen, the mice did not develop bowel cancer. They had what's called pre-cancerous changes in their bowel, which is to say, not cancer. So on the basis of mice, which were injected with a chemical known to cause bowel cancer, who didn't develop bowel cancer, this study was used by the World Health Organization to prove that red meat causes bowel cancer. This study is freely available for anybody to go and look up. And I encourage you, please go and look it up. If you look up Dr. Georgia Eade, I believe she'll have a link to it on her website. This is not hidden information. This is information which is accessible to everybody. And everybody who reads this, you should be shocked at the level of scientific.
Why would they do that? I mean, is there an ideological drive towards animal welfare or climate issues, or is it just sort of poor science, if you think it is?
I'm no political scientist, and I don't profess to know everybody's motivations. I know there are some people who will talk about there being certain religious influences within certain organizations, with people would suggest that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is focused on vegan, vegetarian lifestyles and doing everything they can to discourage red meat consumption. I don't know how true that is. There's certainly, in terms of climate science, I believe there's been some misinformation put out there with regards to red meat being a major cause of global warming, which is interesting when you consider it wasn't that long ago that 60 to 100 million biosim were roaming around North American plains. I mean, there's just these things that just don't add up. But I probably don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much. But in my personal belief, there must be some motivations behind it, because I doubt that you could have this level of error occurring just by happenstance.
You've also raised serious concerns about vegan diets, not with the ideology of them, but with evidence. And you've said that, well, countries like Belgium now legally mandate medical monitoring and supplements for vegan children, or parents risk jail. What does this say about the risks, and why is it not more widely discussed?
Look, this is really interesting. So for me, if I think logically about, we're often fed information that would purport that a vegetarian, or especially a vegan diet, is the healthiest diet that we could have. Now, my feeling is that if a diet is the optimally healthy diet that I should have, it should be able to keep me alive. That's a pretty low bar. If this is meant to be a healthy diet, it should be able to keep me alive. So To explore this a little bit further, we'll go back to the 1920s. So in the 1920s, there was a condition, and I quote, "It was considered universally fatal." And that condition was pernicious anemia, where there's a problem within the gastrointestinal tract whereby vitamin B12 is not able to be absorbed. And in these people in the 1920s, people with pernicious anemia, it was known they couldn't absorb vitamin B12 and they just died. I quote again, "It was universally fatal. Without being able to absorb vitamin B12, people would eventually die." It was then discovered that the liver actually contained concentrated amounts of vitamin B12 and that these people could be saved from an early grave by injecting them with beef liver extract. And following on from that, we understood that they couldn't absorb B12 in the diet, but you could still directly put it in the body, and here we are today. Now, the thing is, vegan foods have exactly 0 vitamin B12. If you're on a vegan diet and you do not supplement, you will eventually die. The vegan diet without supplementation cannot sustain life. How can that be the most healthy diet?
Well, people do supplement, and they would say successfully so, and they can live perfectly well and healthily on those diets with
The fact that they
supplementation.
need to supplement is indicating the nutritional deficiencies that are inherent within that diet. But they
So,
don't call it supplementing. They call it a well-balanced vegan diet. There's never They don't say, artificially supplemented. They talk about it being well-balanced as though if you consume a broad enough range of foods, you'll be healthy. What they don't consider is that one of their food groups just happens to be packets of, bottles of vitamins.
we've touched on all the things that are and aren't wrong with our diets, but we do have, I think, 2/3 of the UK population is either overweight or obese, and we have a huge growing problem here. Now, you've consistently said that obesity isn't a matter of willpower or calories alone, but of metabolic harm from bad dietary advice. And as a sports medicine physician working with athletes, how do you translate that to our viewers to sort of frontline knowledge? What are people doing wrong, and what should they and shouldn't they be doing? And why have we got this obesity problem?
So, one thing, that we know whenever we, see people who are overweight, on average, the average overweight person has a problem with insulin or insulin resistance. And there's 2 dietary factors that I believe are responsible for the vast majority of insulin resistance. The first one is our consumption of seed oils, and the second one is the consumption of fructose-containing sugars. And I think that's the low-lying fruit. If there was 2 things that anybody could do to make significant strides to improving their health, it would be to avoid the consumption of seed oils and to avoid the consumption of fructose-containing sugars. So let's talk about seed oils for a moment. Now, this is the easy one to cut out. Now, when I say easy, it's because seed oils really they're no tastier. They don't add to a food in a way that saturated fat can't. If you take out soybean oil, you can put in tallow or lard or butter or something like that perfectly fine, and it will probably enhance the taste of the food. There's a reason McDonald's had to be coerced to stop frying their chips in tallow. It's because they're genuinely better chips. They taste nicer. So if you're able to eliminate seed oils from the diet, there's no consequences to your taste. Your dietary quality, your enjoyment of your diet will probably actually improve. So in terms of
Find
seeds, that's
olive oil in that mix, or
olive oil is a halfway house. So without boring you with the biochemistry, it isn't quite as deleterious as the more polyunsaturated oils, but it's not as good as the saturated fats. So
You're talking
if you
about butter.
I'm talking about lard, butter, tallow, suet, ghee, these kind of fats. So if you can, stop cooking at home in vegetable oil and use real fats, go back to, in Australia here, I remember my grandparents would have something called a dripping pot in the kitchen. They would have a lamb roast and they would collect all the fat and that would be sitting next to the stove. And the next morning you'd fry your eggs in that fat. So, just reuse the natural fat.
And what
That's
about
that's
the you've talked about carbs, pastas, rice, bread. That's another thing you say we're overeating. Is that right?
Well, let's have a look at the most harmful though. So not all carbs are equal. And so when we're talking about something like rice or corn or wholemeal bread or potatoes, all of what we know as complex carbohydrates, they're made of glucose molecules. So you've got a glucose molecule and it's got a bond to another glucose molecule, and you end up with a chain of these. And when you get more than about 5 or 6, we officially call that a complex carbohydrate. Now, glucose, if you've got problems with insulin resistance and you're on the spectrum of pre-diabetes or what have you, then when you eat that potato, those molecules of glucose, the bonds between them will be broken, and that will enter your circulation, that will enter your bloodstream. Now, in one sense, if you're metabolically unwell, those complex carbs can absolutely be a problem. But there's something that's even worse, and it's fructose containing sugars. They're far sweeter than glucose. So what happens is you get one molecule of glucose and you join it to one molecule of fructose. And that makes table sugar or sucrose. Or you might be able to get similar ratios in high fructose corn syrup, or we sometimes know it as fruit sugar. But fruit sugar is roughly on average 50-50 glucose. Fructose, again, it's like table sugar. Now, with the fructose content of that becomes particularly harmful in terms of causing insulin resistance and its association with fatty liver disease and diabetes and all of these other things. So if there was something after cutting out the seed oils, cut out the fructose sugars. Don't have your fruit juice. You should never drink your fruit. Don't have soft drinks. Don't have concentrated forms of sugar. If it's tasting really sweet, it's probably got fructose in it, and you don't want to be having that. So the low-lying fruits are, if cut out the fructose containing sugars, cut out the seed oils, and most people's metabolic health will significantly improve. And a lot of people will actually be able to get away with having moderate amounts of rice and potatoes and bread and so on and so forth if they're metabolically healthy. The trouble is, the further down the pathway of metabolic disease you go, the less of those complex carbohydrates you can have. I mean, and this is not rocket science. I mean, I've got books on my bookshelf of diet books from the 1960s, and every housewife in Australia knew, oh, you want to drop a couple of kilos? Cut out the bread and potatoes. We know that these foods are inherently fattening. So it's not rocket science, but the low-lying fruits, get rid of the seed oils, get rid of the sugar. And if you've still got a problem, that's when you probably need to, take the knife to the carbohydrates you're having as well.
We're running out of time, but I just wanted to touch on two more things. One of them is you have said that these carbohydrates and the sugars actually make you hungrier. So they not only mess with your metabolism and increase your weight, but they fuel your appetite. Am I right?
Oh, that's absolutely correct. So when we talk about this concept of insulin resistance, now, what I'm saying in a nutshell is that the insulin in your body stops working properly. And that's because on your cells, you've got something called an insulin receptor. And the area of the cell that houses that insulin receptor is a bit disrupted. So that's why the insulin receptor is not working. It's not the insulin is perfectly normal. It's the insulin receptor that is causing the resistance. Well, did you know that you've got something called dopamine receptors that are also in similar parts of the cell membrane to insulin receptors? So if your insulin receptors aren't working properly, it also means that your dopamine receptors are probably not working properly. And dopamine is the chemical that makes you feel good. That's what gives you the rewarding sensation when you're eating nice food. So if you're finding that you're living in a grey veil, you've probably just not got a normal amount of dopamine activity. You might have all the dopamine there, but it's just not working normally. So how do we chase dopamine in our modern world? We eat sweet foods. We eat these foods that are crafted by scientists to have something called the bliss point to be very addictive. And that will squeeze a little bit more dopamine out into our brain, and it will give us a bit of transient respite from living in that grey cloud. So, in effect, when you get that hug from somebody you really like, who you're attracted to, that warm, fuzzy feeling you get, that's dopamine talking. But you can get a hug from sugar as well. It's doing the same thing. It's releasing dopamine into the brain. The problem is that you're eating crappy foods. It's going to make the dopamine resistant worse. And then you're just ending up in a bit of a self perpetuating cycle. But absolutely, if you're insulin resistant, then that will be associated with more food cravings simply because your dopamine is also not working properly. And that's why, a lot of people with diabetes, they're depressed. They just don't feel that joy in life anymore. The chemicals within their brain aren't working as they once did.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not just about willpower and why don't you just stop. So in the final sort of section, this is quite a bombshell, I thought. You did an investigation into the weight loss drugs, and you found that even in the trial studies, up to 40% of the weight lost from these new drugs is not fat, but it's muscle and bone. And there's also an alarming fracture risk, particularly in women. And can you outline what you've discovered and how you discovered it and what it means for the future?
Okay, well, so in 2021, there was a study published called the Step 1 trial. And that was a landmark trial showing that these drugs, what we call, things like Ozempic, glucagon like peptide receptor agonists, would lead to weight loss. After 68 weeks of having this injection, the average weight loss in the participants in this study was 16.86 kilograms, which is a whopping amount. That's absolutely fabulous. But when you actually went to look at the supplementary material that wasn't, really obvious, you had to dig to find it, then 39%, so near 40% of the weight that was lost was actually lean tissue. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. So we know that you're losing muscle and bone.
In muscle and
You're heading towards osteoporosis. This is bad news. But when the subjects went off this drug, there was a follow-up paper on this same study that within 12 months, the average regain of weight, on average, subjects regained 2/3 of the weight they'd lost. Now, they didn't tell us whether or not they'd actually gained any bone. So they've lost 40% muscle and bone, and we still have no evidence that they gained any of it back. They might have just gained all the fat back plus a little bit more. We've got no evidence that this bone and muscle loss is reversible, which is potentially a catastrophic finding. Now, interestingly, there was a randomized controlled trial done in Denmark. It was double blinded. It was absolutely, very well done. It was over 52 weeks. And this study actually confirmed that the subjects lost bone, but then they also looked at a marker of bone resorption. So there's some blood tests and urine tests we can do that actually tell us how much bone somebody is actually breaking down. If you're breaking down high levels of bone or not, then we know that your bone density is going to be reducing over time. And this study in Denmark on these same class of drugs found that the rate of bone breakdown over the 52-week study actually continued to increase. It didn't plateau at all. It continued to increase as the study progressed. So the longer these subjects stayed on it, the more bone they were losing. So this puts some people in a really invidious position. So we know that you take the drug for, let's say, a year, you've lost a bunch of weight. Then you're faced with a choice. Do you stop the drug and get all the fat back again? Or do you continue taking the drug and increase the risk that your bones are going to get even weaker and weaker and weaker. And this is not an academic esoteric risk. So the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia, they've actually on their website for the product approval, the information on this class of drugs, they actually identified that this study that I've just referred to, the data, the unpublished data, but it was made available to the TGA, indicated that females increase their risk of fractured hip, which is a really bad thing to happen, I don't need to tell you, by 5 times. 500% increased risk of hip fracture in females who were taking this drug for 12 months or a little over 12 months, which is absolutely massive. And given that we know the risk continues to increase, your bone continues to degrade over time the longer you're taking it, what kind of choice is that? Stop the drug and get fat again, or keep taking it and really, have an unacceptably high risk of breaking your bones in the future.
Would
Um,
you say these drugs shouldn't be on the market? Should we not use them because of the potential risks? And we haven't had them long.
I don't think that's a question that I'm going to have to answer for much longer, because the reality is, and if you listen to people like Zoe Harcum, who is very, very astute and has looked into the history of these drugs, then there's already several drugs in this class that have been removed from the market for whatever reason. And I would anticipate that over time, these drugs will continually be removed from the market. I mean, they are incredibly profitable, and I mean, that's obviously one motivation why they may perhaps be still on the market at the moment. I think it's probably, and don't hold me to this, but my prediction is it's only a matter of time before I think people get more visibility. And unfortunately, people's desire to lose weight is so powerful. I don't think we can rely on people to necessarily uh, be sensible necessarily about the choices they make. I feel that this is an area where there may need to be a degree of regulation coming in to say, well, look, these drugs are just going to lead to catastrophic costs to the health system in the future. Everybody who breaks a hip, that's very expensive. Increased risk of heart disease, so on and so forth. This is going to end up, we don't want to bankrupt the health system because of this tsunami of osteoporosis, which may very well come our way. So I think the decision, I think these drugs will eventually be removed from the market.
Fascinating. So, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been really interesting. I'm Lucy Johnston. This is GB News Originals. Please don't forget to like and subscribe below and download the GB News app, now available on the App Store. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mason.
My absolute pleasure.